Today at The Update we have the honour of interviewing Sir Chris Bonnington. This British mountaineer is one of the finest and has a remarkable career behind him. This interview will address the world of climbing and the achievements he has brought to the domain. So hello, I understand you started climbing at the age of 16 in 1951, only 2 years before the first ascent of Everest was made by Tenzing and Hillary. How does one come across climbing in the 1950s?
With me, it was almost by chance, in the sense that I suppose I'd always enjoyed wandering, and the fact that what contributed to it, my mum was a single parent and was working hard. She was in advertising, basically to put me through school, and therefore she had to do something with me in the holidays, and so I'd go off I was sent off with friends or this, that or the other, and in that process I was getting into the hills. And also my grandfather, who was German, had retired but worked for the British all his life, had retired to Dublin to be for the Second World War in a neutral country, I think. And so I'd go and stay with him, and so I could see the Wicklow Hills from his house. And that was the first hill I ever climbed. And then I noticed these big hills in Wales. As you travel back, you go on the ferry to Holyhead and then by the train round the northern part of the Snowdonia. And I just thought it would be great to go and climb them. And so it was things like that. And another thing, I was staying after that holiday, and I was staying with a maiden aunt in Wallasey, and she had a book of Poucher pictures. Poucher was a very good mountain photographer of the pre-war period. And just looking at those pictures of hills, and all of these things kind of built up in me, and I decided, well, I'll go and climb Snowdon, and chose the roughest kind of time I could possibly have done it, knowing absolutely nothing about it. And I mean, the amazing thing is that my mum, and particularly my mate Anton's parents, who knew absolutely nothing of the mountains, let us go. And, you just can't see that happening now. And today, I think it's almost too easy to get into the mountains, and there's so many courses and everything else and outdoor activities at schools, where, of course, back in the early 50s, there's nothing like that at all.
Your first major climb was Annapurna 2 in 1960. What did it feel like putting all that you had learnt into practice?
It was not so much putting all that I'd learned, in the sense that I'd reached, when I started climbing in the Alps, I mean, I was a natural climber, and I very, very quickly moved on to doing the hardest climbs in the Alps. So I was very, very good technically as a mountaineer. And the great thing with climbing, the Alps is, to me, it's the most perfect mountain environment for climbing in the sense that it's high enough to have glaciers, it's high enough to have big mountain weather, but you haven't got all the problems of altitude. So when I went on to the Annapurna expedition, I was considerably, technically, more experienced than anyone else on the expedition. And so that the challenge for me was actually hitting altitude for the first time. And it really does hit you as you get above kind of 5,000 meters and 6,000 meters, going through the process of acclimatization. And basically, you've got to accept the fact that you've got to go very, very slow, low down, and you've got to go up and down, slowly building height. And so really, it was a learning process for me, actually discovering that I could climb at altitude and how to pace myself at altitude, which is a key problem. It's a key challenge about climbing in the Himalayas.
That expedition was a British, Indian and Nepalese climb. What influence do you think climbing has internationally, or even just on a man-to-man or female-to-female basis?
Well, climbing, if arguably, we the British, we invented climbing as a sport. And it was back in the kind of mid-19th century. Before that, I mean, Mont Blanc, for instance, was first climbed, at the end of the 18th century. But they climbed it for science. And for the first part, you know, the early pioneers always took kind of thermometers with them and everything, and they were measuring heights and everything, and they weren't doing it for fun. And then it was actually the British who actually discovered that it could be rather fun to go climbing just for its own sake and without all that paraphernalia. And then through that, it was started to a degree as a British sport, but then inevitably other people took it up. And to be a climber back in the 19th century, you had to be probably not just middle class, you had to be upper middle class, you had to be moderately rich to actually be able to do it. And a revolution to a degree occurred in the kind of late 19th century when Italian and French and particularly German climbers started climbing as well. And they were, because it was on their doorsteps, and it became a much, it was less expensive and a more classless kind of thing. And then not only that, the British had a very set idea about how you should go about climbing. For a start, we'd always had guides, so you always had a guide. Whereas in Germany, in Italy and France, people were beginning to climb much more without guides and were beginning to climb technically as well, particularly in the Dolomites and the Eastern Alps. So it was becoming more and more international. And then, of course, after the Second World War, it really kind of exploded and blossomed. And you got countries, particularly like Japan and Korea, introducing very good climbers, and also the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, so that it became a big international thing. And of course now, today, it is very much international. And I think I thoroughly enjoy climbing from people with from other countries, from other cultures.
I understand you were the first British climber to ascend the North Wall of the Eiger in 1962, which was a very significant climb. And of course it is performed as a team, with some exceptions, but do you feel there is a sense of individualism when you climb a mountain?
I think climbing is a very individual thing. And if you think of it, the basic climbing, where most of us Europeans start, and certainly most Britons start, is climbing on very small crags, on rocks, and then moving up. And then, but you're climbing essentially there as a team. You're still a team, but a team of two. And so you've got the leader, and you've got the person who's belaying and passing on the rope. And the most enjoyable kind of climbing is leading through, so you share all of that. And it was when you get to the Himalayas, and the traditional kind of siege type climbing was the natural thing to do. And I think you always had to do it because of the kind of equipment we had and everything else at that time in the 1930s, right the way through to pretty well the 1970s, 1980s. And then with the improvement of, and there you had big teams, and you also had where the individuals are still climbers, have got all the individuality and competitiveness of climbers, but have got to work together as a group with the probability, say, as on Everest in 1953 and on my expeditions, and only perhaps 2 or 4 people actually get to the top out of 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 people. So you've there got to have, basically, you've got to temper your individual ambition and drive for the good of the team itself. Today things have changed yet again in the sense that with the improvement of equipment, the improvement of technique and our knowledge and everything, you now get the people at the elite of climbing actually going into the mountains either by themselves, solo, or just as a pair, or at the most 4 people, actually and climbing alpine style, where you pack up your rucksack at the bottom and you keep going to the top. And so that is not so much team-like as well. So it is really, it's that period when the siege-style expeditions were carried on, that teamwork was absolutely essential, and there had to be some kind of structure, some kind of hierarchic system. Whereas today, it is much more individual. And of course, if you look at it in a broader social kind of context, that's actually what's happened, I think, in the world anyway today, where it's very much more the individual individual ambition to a degree, individual greed, that actually dictates what happens.
I personally enjoy climbing and all the aspects that comes with it, such as surpassing the former self and the physical well-being it can bring you. What are the values you cherish from the sport, and why should climbing be encouraged just like any other sport?
I think, well, to me, I don't know, see whether how close we check on this. I'd say with me, climbing is firstly, it is the actual physical enjoyment of the process of climbing, which is, if you like, that of any athlete, whether you're a footballer or a skier or whatever. Climbing then has the addition of the thrill of risk and the excitement of risk, and that's a very addictive process. But then there's more than that to it than that. There's also the actual beauty of the mountains. There's also a sense of exploration, both physical exploration of actually going and climbing something that has never been climbed before. So you are actually, you're finding your mountain, you're then finding a way up the mountain. But there's also an exploration of your own self and your own psyche, your own ability. There's the comradeship that you get within climbing as well, which is very intense, and your life literally depends on that of another. And finally, there is that element of competition and ego, to be the first to have done it and to receive recognition from your peers or from your country or whatever it happens to be. And I'd say that's the mix. How about you?
Oh yeah, pretty much the same thing. I really enjoy the fact that you're taking a risk. Even if you're just rock climbing and indoors or something, you've still got that.
Oh yes.
That difference of altitude.
Yeah, the extra spice.
Yeah. Just as a final question, I'm sure you know the reputable Erling Kagge, the first to surmount all 3 poles. His book, Silencing the Age of Noise, explores the importance of silence and its ability to help us understand ourselves. And I was wondering, did your climbs bring you this silence and the understanding of who you are?
I'm not that introspective. I think I've gained huge satisfaction from the climbing I've done, and I suppose my struggle initially was actually finding a way of making a living around climbing so that I could focus on it completely rather than spending an awful lot of my time doing something that I didn't particularly want to do. But I think that the climbing process, and I think particularly when you've been leading expeditions as well, where you do have to, once you actually start being a leader, of actually getting people to do something to achieve an objective, you make mistakes and you need to introspect about how you could have done better, how you could do it better. So I think, life should be a constant kind of discovery, really, of what you can do and where you can go, and I think that's what I've done.